Hare Krishna, dear devotees. Welcome to the 16th episode of the Many Moons podcast. It is a bit of a special podcast today because tomorrow marks the 1 year anniversary of our podcast. So we started this essentially, which was a bit of a pet project between myself and Shraddha a year ago. We just started it with the intention of supporting and serving other Vaishnavis and discussing issues that we felt were of importance to fellow Vaishnavis, and also to give other women a platform to discuss issues related to bhakti. And today we are joined by a very, very special guest, a friend of the forum or friend of the podcast, I must add. We've known Keshava Madhava Prabhu for quite some time whilst doing other services. So we're very excited to have him to discuss today's topic, transcending gender consciousness. So for those of you that don't know Keshava Madhava Prabhu, he was born in Germany, and then he came into Krishna consciousness back in 2001, and then in 2002 he actually joined ISKCON in Germany. Following that, he's traveled across to Austria to learn and serve and preach there. And following that, he stayed in the Brahmachari ashram for over 3 years, serving in different roles within the ashram in Germany. And then, upon completing his Brahmachari duties, he then completed his education. He back in 2008 as an occupational therapist. So he then moved to Zurich in 2009, and since then he's been working in the psychiatric field, where he completed his training as a transformational coach in 2011, and then he moved to Zurich to start his own practice over there, and he's been serving and in the psychology field for many years, and often also works as a devotee counselor and a teacher at the Zurich temple, and he's also in charge of devotee care and counseling department. So he's a very, very qualified person to tackle this topic of transcending gender consciousness. So, a very welcome, Prabhu. Thank you for joining us today to discuss this issue. So, I just wanted to start with the question around how gender is perceived. And we know in Shastras, gender is often depicted in a rather black and white way, with male gender being identified with the sex. Essentially, we see the divine feminine and the divine masculine mentioned. However, in modern society, some people view this whole idea of gender as a social construct. There are people out there, individuals that in the non-binary community, that do not identify themselves as belonging to a particular gender. So how do we view gender in the 21st century in light of how gender was depicted in the Shastras?
Yes. First of all, thank you for having me for this podcast, for the discussion. Well, this question that you raised is certainly a complex one. I think it cannot be answered necessarily so simple. I mean, in my understanding, times, of course, have changed when we look at what is depicted there in the Vedic society, and even like a century ago, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, for example, they pointed out that the varnashrama system, which is essentially Vedic culture, is not existing anymore like that. This distinction between the four varnas and is hardly to be found, particularly if it's about Brahmins. Usually the emphasis is on human beings that have brahminical qualification by birth. So there's a lot of, how to say, there are many ideas or concepts also of gender and people in general that do not match anymore the current situation. Like, for example, if you talk about we want varnashrama dharma, and that people engage according to the occupation, which also involves then gender identity, because one question might be raised: yeah, do also women have a varna? For some, this question might sound strange, but some people bring that up, some devotees, that apparently there are sources saying women have no varna, means that which would practically mean they have no particular psychophysical nature that allows them to engage in a particular type of service based on that nature. Um, so gender roles, yeah, are rather binary in contrast to non-binary. It's clear there's a male and a female with clearly attributed roles, and this is in a strong contrast to what we have nowadays, where people take a distance from certain gender, how to say, concepts. Um, and yeah, I think it's something that needs to be figured out. How, like, the for example, Krishna consciousness movement, with its historical background and philosophical background, theology background, will deal with that. Particularly if there's um, it's more a psychological reality, because I think genders in itself biologically haven't changed. There's a male, there's a female body, essentially, that's always there. When you take birth, you take either birth in a male body or in a female body, and rarely, also gender-wise, there's a mixed gender, where, like, a human being has both gender parts visibly or not visibly. So the question of whether you identify with something or not is another thing. There's one. I think one thing is important: the biological reality, and the other thing is the psychological reality. How do I relate to what's biologically there? And this is more of an issue nowadays than it maybe was back then in Vedic times. So, yeah, I think that's where we stand. I think it's a discussion.
Yeah, so why do you think people disconnect from gender? Why do you think we've gone from, back in the day where, nobody questioned those black and white concepts around gender and identification of gender? But why do you think that so many people disconnect with the whole concept of gender and think that it is a social construct?
There's certainly a variety of reasons, and if you talk of social construct, for example, then we also talk of a lot of discrimination in a not just like how to say, intellectual sense. I distinguish one thing from the other, but there's unfair treatment. There is um, a certain idea that one, for example, gender is superior to the other, and following from that, one gender gets treated in a way that is unjust, that is perhaps or like exploitative, and so on. So of course, then resistance develops because it has not really a basis in, let's say, nature. It's more like it has its basis in what we call the false ego, that we identify as superior or inferior based on the ego, so to say, we have. And people make experiences. It can be also traumatic experiences. In my field, I also work with people who experience sexual abuse and other types of abuse. And this may also be a significant factor or reason why people disconnect from the gender they have, so to say, assigned biologically. That, for example, a woman which identified before as a woman or heterosexual now turns to be like lesbian or homosexual, however you might call it, or like even completely disconnects from sexual identity because it has a traumatic, how to say, there's a strong traumatic impact. And it might be social injustices that go along with a lack of, for example, equal opportunities for men and women, or women in particularly, to uh, engage according to their nature, to have opportunities in work life in general in life. being limited to certain roles. So I think there's a variety of reasons why people feel not just resistant, perhaps resentful toward certain concepts of gender.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And also, just to kind of echo that, there are certain things that we might discuss today that can be very sensitive. And also, just want to reiterate, we're just opening up the discussion. And, please do feel free to engage in our comment section in the Facebook. But I do want to put the disclaimer out there because there are certain people that might feel very strongly about certain issues that we discussed today. They can be very sensitive, and what we are aiming to do is shed some light, looking at the Shastras, and shed some light into it, whilst also making it a practical discussion. So none of it that we discuss today aren't expected in a mood of, that, to take it as gospel. And obviously individuals are open to, having their beliefs, and we're not discriminating or looking down on any views held by anybody. So just want to put out there, thank you, Prabhu, for that. A very helpful iteration. But also, I just wanted to touch on. So we talked about briefly around people identifying or not identifying themselves with their gender, and we also briefly covered the biological, the male and the female, kind of aspects around gender. But do we also have examples, perhaps, of trans people from the Shastras? So, because sometimes this is often, you know, quoted that, these kind of people didn't exist, or it was very, the society has always been black or white. So, are there any depictions in the Shastras that allow, that kind of makes us believe actually, there were people that, changed their biological genders?
There are certainly stories in the Mahabharata, for example, where we can see that people change their gender within within their lifespan, back and forth. For example, we can also, maybe let's start, like, there's the story of Arjuna, um, having been cursed by a woman that he rejected because she wanted, of course, that he, I think, gets married with her, or maybe just the intercourse. I'm not sure anymore, but she was rejected and felt very angry about it, and she cursed him to become a eunuch, means to lose his gender practically, that his masculinity, or like his male uh, sexual nature, was gone, which turned out to be a blessing for, since he had to stay for 1 year in exile undetected. And then he was known by the name Prihanala, so he changed also name, he changed his appearance, he dressed differently, and he trained women in certain arts that were, yeah, the culture or the custom there. So later he received his manhood back. So there's stories where, like, where obviously there's the ability of living beings, of like higher living beings or like powerful living beings, that they can influence their gender situation, or like can influence the gender situation of others. um, then we hear of maybe a more strong example that relates to the transgender reality, that Amba, the one of the three sisters, Ambika and Ambalika, Amba, who was taken by Bhishma against her will in order to be married to the princess in Hastinapur. Um, she ultimately, on her journey to take revenge of Bhishma Dev, um, received the opportunity to switch genders even within her lifetime. There was a Raksha once, a Yaksha. She, after, her story is a bit longer, but one part of the story was that the Yaksha also agreed to lend her the gender, male gender, for a while, because she wanted to take the role of a prince, and there was a marriage arrangement and so on. So where she could switch back and forth. And then there's also the story that later on she received a male body, where she came back, so to say, as Shikandi, and and Bhishma recognized not the man in Shikandi's body, though it was a male body, but he considered him still her, meaning it's Amba in a male shape, wanting to take revenge of him. So these are examples sort of that illustrate that gender can be changed, and that the person remains the same with it. That's what I find interesting. Arjuna remained Arjuna. He didn't suddenly, I mean, according to my knowledge in the Mahabharata, he didn't change his sense of identity, whereas also Amba remained somewhat Amba, although she changed the gender. So I mean, this when we talk about this, these examples are there. Um, yeah. Whereas the what I understand from transgender or like transsexual realities that we talk nowadays is that people um, either feel I'm born in the wrong body with something. I'm in a male body, for example, in a female body, but I feel I don't belong there or don't identify there. I'm actually the opposite. I'm actually a female in a male body, a male in a female body, and then they want to adjust their psychological reality to the physical, or the physical to their psychological reality. That's the way. And so I think that's a difference if you compare it with the Shastric statements where there rather for example in Arjuna's case, this was imposed upon him by a curse, and it was not his kind of sense. Oh, I'm actually not identifying with it, so therefore I change. And also with Amba, she was coming from a different place. It was not the issue was not whether am I identifying as a woman or not. It was more the culture that forced her. I need a male body to do that, right?
Thank you so much, Prabhu, for sharing those two examples. I know we have more examples in our scriptures of devotees or people changing their gender within the same lifetime. And one thing that I found interesting about the story of Arjuna is that when he had that change and he was considered to be a eunuch for that period of time, that his social position was also changed, and that he was allowed to, closely associate with women, and he was trusted, with young women, and he served as their dance teacher, which I find interesting because sometimes in the devotee community, uh, we're uncomfortable, with people who might not, identify, with their gender assigned at birth, and we feel that, we need to still have them following the exact same like rules, as we would for someone who did identify with their birth gender. So I think this is interesting. He was in a different category, and therefore a different set of rules did apply to him. And I think as more and more people, are identifying as trans or are identifying with a gender different than that of assigned to their birth, this is something as devotees and as people thinking about the community will have to start thinking about, and will have to start discussing. Like, just because you see someone as a man doesn't necessarily mean that that person, is going to relate to other people as a man, and doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be comfortable, being boxed in as because you're a man you're only allowed to do, x and y.
Perhaps to yes, I see here relating to Arjuna. I see one comment here. Arjuna disguised himself as a transgender woman, not that he became a transgender woman. That's a difference. My understanding is different. I don't think he became like, maybe my understanding of definitions is wrong here. Um, but he became a non-gender person. He didn't switch to becoming a female. He just lost his manhood. He was like a eunuch, those who were castrated practically. So he was not considered a man anymore, so to say, sexually not a threat to the women there. So that's why he was allowed to. So similarly, maybe there's a story. Maybe you could see that maybe in connection um, to Shukadev Goswami and his father Vyasadeva. There's an interesting account in the Srimad Bhagavatam, which is not so much about gender identification, but about how do different genders respond to someone of the opposite sex, using these terms now a bit like as they used. Um, that they saw, for example, when Shukadev left home and Vyasadeva ran after him because, I mean, Shukadev was 16 years in the womb and then came out and then just ran away from home, not wanting to be there. Um, there were women bathing in the lake, and when they saw Shukadev Goswami coming, they felt no discomfort whatsoever. They're completely fine, though he appeared like naked in a male body. And why? Because he was completely free from any sex desire. He did not identify with the body at all. What to speak of gender didn't matter. What gender, he was not identified with the material body. And I think this is a very essential thing, um, that goes along with the spiritual realized person. It's not about what type of body I'm in, but simply that I'm in a body is the primary issue, which of course brings secondary issues. And then later, Vyasa, he came after Shukadev Goswami. Then the women became shy and felt ashamed because they were bathing, and they covered himself. Because why? Apparently, Vyasadeva was perceived as still having a bodily identification, having certain sexual interest. And so I find this is also something when we come to the point of different people allow different things based on either, let's say, gender role identification or detachment also from certain sexual inclinations that go with the gender.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. I think we need to acknowledge that it is a complex situation. As you were rightly pointing out, Arjuna might have been allowed to be so closely associating with the women because he was regarded to be sexless. And the example you gave is another personality who's regarded to have been beyond a sexual identification. But if we look at the example of Amba, who became Shikandi in the next lifetime, after some time, I mean, she was born a woman again, but then we know she had this experience with a Raksha and they exchanged genders. He became a man, but we see that there was a level of ambivalence about her because Arjuna, on the one hand, did have her as his charioteer, but on the other hand, for the Bhishma, that he still saw her as a woman, and for that reason, he would not take up arms. So we have to acknowledge that even in that situation, it seems that there wasn't like a clear-cut solution. There was like a bit of a confusion, even for the characters in the Mahabharata. Is this a woman or is this a man? So I just think it's good to acknowledge.
Mm-hmm.
We're not making a moral judgment. We're just making an observation that different people might need to relate, to people that identify as trans in different ways. I think it's just good to acknowledge that.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is that it is, how to say, generally people may not be able to really relate to what's going on there because usually what I see is what I think it is. If I see a male person, male body, person, female body, then for most people that's clear. Normally, yeah, but that's a man, that's a woman. And if this person has a completely different experience of this reality of gender, so of course there is the where it becomes complicated. Because of course the irritation is there, and it's not irritation alone is not a judgment. It's simply a reaction, respond to a certain also way of how I'm used to perceive things. What is my world view? What is my understanding of gender, male, female? And yeah, the irritation is there certainly, but I think it's also be careful to not equate irritation with judgment immediately. It can follow from that, you know, but it
Yes,
requires
yes.
openness to understand what's going on with this other person there and why, you know.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. Just referring that there is someone commenting in our comment section. They're asking whether we are referring to third gender people. We do acknowledge that in Vedic culture, that is a category that does exist. We've got men, we've got women, and then we've got people of the third gender. So we do acknowledge that. We also acknowledge that there are many places in scripture that, this group of people is mentioned. So we do acknowledge that. At the same time, we are aware that in the current society, people identify way more genders. So, for that reason, it's difficult to speak in a way which is going to be inclusive, of all terminology. But yes, we do acknowledge that there is such a thing in scripture. So now moving on to a different topic. What does it mean if we say we want to transcend gender consciousness?
Yes, transcending gender consciousness, like, um, in general, the so-called bodily concept of life is simply put, as Krishna said to Arjuna, rise above the three modes of nature. So because now we're under the influence of the three modes of nature, and based on that also we have certain understandings of the body and how we are the body or not, and also in regards to gender. And we are supposed to make steps that allow us to go above this influence, that we're not anymore under it, but above it. So, and that means to not be determined in our view of ourselves, or like I'll say limited by what we identify as the gender. That might be a similar thing like with nationality, race, and so on, that these are also strong identifications which are rooted in the physical and subtle body we have. And all those, in a sense, we can say no matter what type of physical consciousness one has, if it's about gender, if it's about race, if it's about nationality and so on, these things all go in the same direction. We identify with something we are not. Although we are not that doesn't mean it doesn't exist anymore. Of course we have it, we have this body, we have this role, and the understanding would be, instead of thinking I am the role I play, to understand that's a role I play. But beyond this role, I'm more than that, I'm different than that, I have been different roles already. And this is essentially what the Bhagavad Gita, what Krishna also teaches to Arjuna in the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. He first addresses him saying, all your concerns not to fight based on certain family identification. These are my relatives. I cannot fight with them because this is based on the material concept of life, and you are not this material body, and therefore you are also not really a relative. This is more like a concept, if you talk of concepts, and at the same time he addresses him as a Kshatriya. You are a Kshatriya, he says, therefore your duty is to fight. So he does both things. He addresses Arjuna as a spiritual soul. At the same time, he addresses him in his role as a Kshatriya. But the first thing is most important to understand. And if you come from the place of, I'm a spiritual soul and I have this role now that I get to play, that would be the approach that is desired. Instead of thinking, I'm this role, and there's also spirituality.
Thank you so much, Prabhu, for making that, I think, very valuable distinction. It's not that we're going to deny the role that we play, but we just see it as such. As Shakespeare said, that all the world is a stage and men and women are merely actors playing their parts. So I think that's very valuable to meditate upon that. So we can, in a sense, be grounded in our gender identity, whichever identity that is we choose to have, but at the same time not allow ourselves that becomes the main determining factor for determining the course of our lives, because I think that can very easily happen. And it's not only gender, it can happen with your culture, with your race, with your occupation, with so many misidentifications. We can give it, I think, too much importance. But now a follow-up question on that is, how do we differentiate between when you've transcended your gender and being disconnected from your gender? Because we also sometimes, I think often in spiritual communities, find this phenomenon that people are almost disconnected from the body. They're almost in denial of the needs of the body. And as you said, we are not the gender and we're not the body, but the body is the body. And the body will still have its needs. And we're not the mind, but the mind is the mind. And the mind still has its needs. So what is the difference between transcending and being disconnected?
Yes, thank you. As the word says, disconnection means I don't have access anymore to it. It becomes something that may become unconscious or subconscious, and it doesn't mean though it is gone. It will start to affect me on an unconscious level, which is connected to the mode of ignorance, or tamagun. Tama means that what covers, what is ignorance or darkness. So it becomes not visible anymore. I deny it, although it's there. So disconnecting means that I choose not to look at it anymore, choose not to deal with it anymore productively. I mean, not that I can really escape it, but I try to. So I'm more in a, how to say, battle. I'm in a battle with what's going on for me physically and then emotionally, mentally. Whereas transcending means I consciously rise above, which provides that I'm in touch, that I'm connected. I cannot transcend something that I'm not connected with. So the principle is, if something is not accessible to me, let's say also besides like gender identity, any type of either emotion or personality, part of my personality, for example, that I have difficulties with, weaknesses, and I disconnect from them. So I cannot transform them, I cannot access them because, in a sense, I decided they're not allowed to exist anymore. So, and there we go. Like, if it's about also, first of all, having a level of acceptance. If we talk of role, that's what I have now. Might be a sexual orientation, a gender identification, whatever it might be. So I have it now, and at the same time, I'm attempting to transform or develop with it to a higher level, kind of saying I have it, but I'm not limited or, how to say, totally controlled by it. Whereas when we disconnect, ironically, the thing happens, we become controlled actually by that we disconnect from, subconsciously or unconsciously then. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. I think that was a very valuable distinction. And I think we can see in the case where we're disconnecting, that almost relates, to how we define being in Maya, because being in Maya means that we are, vision is disconnected. We can't see how everything is connected to Krishna. Instead we see everything, in separation. We see everything as being different. So I find that very interesting. And on the other hand, when we're transcending, there is no denial, but there's acceptance, and then there is, a proper engagement, of ourselves and of our identity and of our gender. So thank you so much. I think it's a very important thing that we should, I think, meditate upon often.
Perhaps I may add to it, it comes to mind, like when we talk of transcending, it's also a conscious letting go of it. Instead of when I disconnect, I fight it off. Like, although I did not let go of it. I'm still identified, but negatively. There's always positive and negative identification. Also, let's say love to a person is a positive identification. I love that person, and then that we are together, we are one. And the negative version of it is, I hate that person. This is also a form of connection. It's not that this person therefore doesn't exist anymore for me. On the contrary, it exists in a very negative way within me. My connection is there. Whereas, for example, I let this person go, or I forgive that person and I go my way and I accept what happened, for example, that would be an example of kind of transforming, or what we say perhaps transcending. It's maybe a different level, but where we say we consciously let go of something based on a process we have underwent. That's a very important thing, that we have a spiritual practice that shall allow us gradually to lose identification with the body. It's not meant, I mean, also in my understanding, like, it's my physical identification. It would be simply a lie if I say, yes, I'm not affected by the body and the gender that I have. I mean, but it's a gradual process where I'm on the way by following sadhana practice and by cultivating knowledge, where I see gradually I rise above it.
Thank you. I think that was a really interesting. I think the point, the focus is conscious letting go, that you consciously transcend gradually, like you mentioned, rather than that having a negative connotation to it. But no, thank you very much. I'd like to move us on to I know we just talked about transcending gender. However, I think our viewers at home, particularly the Vaishnavis, would like us to, I think, explore how different genders, particularly how women perhaps are depicted in the Shastras actually. So we see in Srimad Bhagavatam 1.4.24, there is a reference in the purport that says, sorry, the translation that says, the less intelligent classes of men, namely women, Shudras, and unqualified sons of the higher castes, are devoid of necessary qualifications to understand the purpose of transcendental Vedas. For them, the Mahabharata was prepared. So this alludes that Mahabharata, a simplified form, a story was written for those that were less intelligent to understand the Shastras. And it interestingly puts women alongside Shudras and also the unqualified sons of the high caste, is, the Dvija Bandhus that are being referred to there. So, how can we in a modern world understand and interpret comments like this? Because some people may see this as very offensive, as the Shastras depicting women as a simple bunch of people that are not able to understand the transcendental knowledge.
Yes, first of all, I would like to point out that it is important exactly that, as you said, in the same sentence, women, Shudras, and those are the unqualified sons of twice-born. So it's not essentially women versus or compared to men. It's actually a certain type of people, first of all, that involves men. Shudras are also men. And another statement in our time, Kali Yuga, it said, Kalo Shudra Sambhava. Every man also, essentially, in Kali Yuga is considered to be on the platform of Shudra, which means less intelligent. Less intelligent means, in the first place, in my understanding, it's about not having the consciousness to distinguish matter from spirit, to be engrossed in material nature, and therefore tend to be rather, how to say, instinct driven, or like driven by senses and mind, maybe intoxication, eating, unregulated life, like that. It's not so much necessarily the brain capacity in terms of, for example, understanding concepts or gathering knowledge and information, like in that, the different types of intelligence, of course. And that would be important to, if men would use that argument to point out, okay, women are less intelligent, they're not very intelligent in reading the sentence, because it also it follows, the sentence includes men as well. And if you know Shastra a bit and understand what logically follows, if everyone is in Kali Yuga as a Shudra, that generally men are less intelligent in Kali Yuga as well. So it's a judgment, so to say, passed practically on the whole Kali Yuga population, and it would be wrong to just take it on it says women are less intelligent. Of course, but still it stands there as a distinction generally in other places, where it is said that women are less intelligent. At the same time, we have other statements that we need to kind of reconcile with that. For example, that Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, let me just open it up, in
9.36, isn't it?
no, there's one, just give me a
3.2.
second. I open it up here, for example. Yeah. No, in the 10th chapter in the Bhagavad Gita, 10:34, Krishna identifies his vibhutis, or the opulences. And he said, among women, I'm fame, fortune, fine speech, memory, intelligence. So the seven, Prabhupada comments, the seven opulences listed, fame, fortune, fine speech, memory, intelligence, steadfastness, and patience, are considered feminine. So we here are again in the gender category. If you say what attributes are being given to a certain sex, I must remark, or like how to say, just say, we had this before in the German language, because I come from Germany. We actually don't have a distinction between sex and gender. This is kind of a unified term, is gender. On legal papers and passports, it's gender. There's no extra kind of thing. So therefore, for me, usually it's my conditioning that goes together. Although of course I understand that there are distinctions made based on cultural values, attributes, and so on. So here Krishna also says that that intelligence is a feminine quality. And in the teachings of Queen Kunti, for example, you find Srila Prabhupada also often relating to the intelligence, for example, regarding Queen Kunti as very highly intelligent or most intelligent, because she recognized Krishna. She could see him and she was spiritually realized. So I think it has to be relativized. It always stands in context to being able to grasp spiritual subject matters, which provides that one is not too much absorbed or determined by one's physical body and mind, that one is, so to say, covered. So, but this is something that is individual. A woman can be more advanced in spiritual understanding than a man, depending how she engages, how much. Okay, maybe I think I already said a lot, so
No,
perhaps.
no, 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 that's all very helpful, Prabhu. And I think you made it very, clear. We shouldn't be too absorbed in our gender. And, obviously, when interpreting these sorts of sort of references to genders, particularly around intelligence, which some people in modern world could take it very, very offensively. You need to look at the context and actually understand. And often, anything could be used out of context in a sort of discriminatory or derogatory sense. So we've got to be careful. However, having said that, there's lots of other references like the Bhagavad Gita 9.32, where Krishna says, essentially, as long as one takes shelter in Krishna, anybody, even though they're of lower birth, women, vaishyas and shudras, can achieve that transcendental position or understand the transcendental knowledge. So it kind of surprises me that for a sort of bunch of people like the Hare Krishnas that always keep saying we're not the body, we're not the body, we're the soul, and we shouldn't be identifying ourselves with the body so much. We somehow actually have extensive rules around segregation of gender, things like chastity, abstinence, that can actually make people more preoccupied with gender and sexuality. For instance, women should be acting in certain ways because they've got a feminine body, the butter melters sort of things we hear. So we seem to be somewhat really preoccupied with it. Why do you think that's the case?
As you already pointed out, there's a whole set of rules or cultural framework that certain groups of devotees want to reinforce, particularly um, with the understanding perhaps that's very shastric, that's very Vedic, and that's why it is right. Often there's this very simple thinking that's right, so therefore the other thing is wrong. Um, I agree with you. We had this discussion also that actually this strong emphasis on how to say behavioral codes between male and female based on the, let's say, the fear there could be sex attraction, there could be illicit sex, or there could be, yeah, attraction, um, is actually can have the contrary effect. If I constantly make you aware this could be attractive or this could make you and then you constantly meditate on like on the fear of attraction perhaps. And where's your meditation? It's not on Krishna. It's on being afraid to perhaps feel attraction to the opposite sex or the same sex. Um, so therefore, I think it's not very thought through if he kind of simply puts too much emphasis on it. There is certainly, we see that, of course, if men and women simply mingle, if the term is still used nowadays, I don't know, then yes, of course, this can happen. It's the nature of things that attraction happens. But also, what is important to understand, we see that practically in modern life, not every man feels attracted to every woman and vice versa. I mean, seriously, there's so many people who are just like nothing. You could put them together in a room for years and they would probably not. Of course, that's not the rule for everything, but I just want to say, to create this kind of understanding, whatever a woman in whatever circumstance, whatever man in whatever circumstance, that you assume this very danger, this is very toxic. And because based on fear, exactly that could develop what you want to avoid. So yeah, it needs to be considered holistically. What is most important, our philosophy says, we're supposed to develop a higher taste. We're supposed to develop an attraction to Krishna, and in this connection, appreciate other living entities in whatever body they are, and encourage them in the service. and that would be a positive way to disconnect. No, not disconnect, not but to rise above the material platform.
I think that's really interesting. The point you made that lots of these kind of, overly identifying with the genders and placing certain rules comes from that fear. And often that fear I've heard, it's that fear that, God forbid, if you keep the genders to get too close together, there will be that attraction that will develop that would take them away from, distract them from their spiritual journey or people making spiritual advancements. I understand there is, biological, attractions, which is natural, like you said, sometimes, but I think it becomes then quite toxic and unhealthy when we start broad brushing and trying to kind of introduce, I suppose, some sort of practices that prevents, I think, positive interactions between men and women. I think that's the thing what we always overlook is what value and benefit positive interactions between women and men can add to your devotional service or devotional advancement, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Essentially, I agree, and I would say I'm. On the other hand, I mean, I would say what is certainly required, because there's also reason for this, for separating the sexes, or like, I mean, it's not that the, yeah, as we said, attraction happens. I think what is a more healthy way, better way, is respectful reservation. That
Mm.
means I'm able to deal with people, like as a man to deal with women and as a woman to deal with men, in a respectful way, where there's always a certain distance, but not a distance in a sense, okay, like, you know, that you better not exist. I don't want to, have to do with you at all, but more like, okay, we are in different bodies. There are certain biological, natural realities that we should acknowledge, so let's be aware of that, and certain etiquette is certainly required and helpful, so that you don't just, like, that you can set certain boundaries, that help you to regulate, also attraction, and yes, but without, like, kind of denying the other person's existence, you know.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you, Prabhu. That was really helpful. That understand having that understanding in a positive and respectful and useful way that is supportive, and there's, rather than putting these artificial barriers between interactions, often based on fear or generalizations, assuming that every man and woman or individual responds to certain situations in a similar way. I think, yeah, very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabu, for shedding light, on interactions between men and women, and also highlighting that it's not that every man and every woman will be, I think, sexually attracted to each other. I also think it's important to acknowledge that attraction doesn't always need to be sexual. Like, you are only friends of people if you're attracted to them. You are only following a certain teacher in whatever, aspect of life, area of life, if you are attracted to them. We can be attracted to people because of their intelligence, because of their warmth, because of their wisdom, because, of their artistic expression. I think that's important to acknowledge. And I think another thing that we don't really discuss in the devotee community is that as a man and a woman, you need a variety of relationships. What I mean by that is, as a woman, I might need a partner, but I also might need a father, and I might need a grandfather and an uncle. And the same for men. Like, men sometimes also need ladies who are like genuine mothers or genuine sisters. So I think we often overlook this, and we emphasize the fact that in Vedic culture there was some segregation between the genders, but we don't emphasize enough that in Vedic culture the vast majority of people would live in extended families. So even if you were a man and you were not, free to just mingle with any woman on the street, you probably had several sisters, you probably had several aunts. In many situations, if you're in the right varna, you even had several mothers. So I think this is something that we overlook. And I think I can acknowledge, I have certain devotees Of course, we need to be careful and follow etiquette, but I've got certain devotees who are in male bodies who I do consider my genuine well wishers and who I really relate to as a father, or older brother. And I very much value them, and those relationships are nourishing to me. So I think this is something that we have to acknowledge, that if we say that, like a man could never relate to a woman without it being sexual, I think then there's something wrong with that individual. Like, if you can't relate to any woman without it being sexual, then you as an individual probably have a mental problem. It's every woman. But if you can't relate to any woman without it being sexual, I mean, I think the problem is with you. The problem is not with, like, just, a woman, and a man in any situation being together. So I think that is something that, yeah, hasn't been acknowledged enough in our society.
Perhaps like then coming back to the whole thing, transcending gender, and gender meaning not sex but also the cultural role and the identification that is there. What comes to my mind when we talk of mother, for example, I just recently was thinking of that Chanakya Pandit is often quoted. Also, Srila Prabhupada used to say that he made the point: someone who's truly learned is identified by certain symptoms, and one or the symptom is he sees every woman besides his own wife as mother. So that's also a clear gender concept that we have in a Vedic society. Women is being seen as mother, mainly, perhaps exclusively. Although there are, other roles, but this role somehow or other is like very much in the foreground. And I must say, for me, this never worked. I could not just say that's particular. If you get older. Now I'm 40, but also when I was trying. So if I see or if I meet like a younger woman that I consider attractive, and it doesn't work for me to make, oh, that's a mother. It just doesn't work. It's not how I'm wired. I don't know. I can say perhaps, okay, it's a beautiful lady, but that's not for me. It's not mine. Perhaps, I say I'm not there in a place to have a relationship or in a relationship, whatever. And like this. But to have this particular view on a woman saying that's a mother, maybe if you get it from very early childhood on, if this is your, let's say, cultural conditioning or training, that might work. But I personally feel that's not, I don't know for how many people this is truly applicable, but that's something that is often highlighted and where I must say, I'm sorry, can't do it.
I think this is very true, Prabhu, and I think that being in a woman's body, we can, and everyone that has that same experience, we can say that we've experienced men calling you mother, but not treating you like mother, not respecting you like mother, not relating to your mother, and that just feels awkward. Like, why do you call me Mataji? And then it's with like a weird tone, a dismissive tone, a flirtatious tone, an inappropriate tone. So then I would say, rather not do that, because it's artificial. Personally, I think that we can, though, try to relate to all devotees as family. Like, I think it could be more natural. Like, okay, yeah, I mean, this is a person that's 20 years younger than me and attractive, but I could try and relate to like a sister, like a younger sister or a cousin, or an aunt. So I think that's more realistic. As you said, then people that haven't grown up in that culture kind of artificially thinking that I should try and act as if I see everyone as mother, but I really don't.
Yeah. Also, before I came to Krishna consciousness, I mean, we know that I was for a while in the Christian community, and there the regular identifications were like, there were the elders, so to speak, who were truly also literally mother and father who had children. They were addressed as, okay, Papa and Mama. They said, like, it was an African Christian kind of a group. Of course, there were also Germans in there, was mixed. And usually we relate to each other as brother and sister. That was the common kind of way. And for me, that worked fine. I thought, brother and sister. It was also the theology comes from it. And we are all children of the same father. So it makes sense to relate to each other as brother and sister. So that's something also for me where I feel like, that can work.
Yes, I know in the Gaudiya Mat, they do often call ladies Didi, which is sister. Rather, I know that Prabhupada, there is a statement where Prabhupada did not approve of that, but I do think even if you feel you need to call people Mataji, for your own sanity and for relationships to be more authentic, you might, relate to them in other, appropriate forms of relationships. Now, Prabhu, to get to another, I think, kind of stereotypical idea we have, and also I think for non we try and lock devotees into certain roles. As you did mention that there are quotes in Shastra, and there are devotees that love to quote these quotes, that women have no varna. So how do we reconcile this idea that women have no varna with the astrological idea that if you look at compatibility, people have to be either of the same varna, or the man has to be of a superior varna? So how do we reconcile these ideas? Because the people that are advocating very loudly that women have no varna are also usually the ones that are very fond of all things Vedic, including Vedic astrology.
Well, certainly very interesting. In a sense, you already pointed out the how to say, the impossibility of really reconciling that. I would first of all like to see where exactly it is stated that women have no varna, because certainly there must be some sources. I personally don't have them. For me, simply, I mean, there's a seminar about Vedic marriage from Gaur Govinda Swami, where it talks about this concept also of aniloma, pratiloma, these types of marriages that are sanctioned and those who don't. And the general principle is a man from a varna can marry a woman from a lower varna, but a woman cannot marry a man from a lower varna, but must either equal varna or higher varna. So a brahmana, for example, could marry a kshatriya wife. A kshatriya woman could marry a kshatriya, but not a vaishya. If then there could be a shudra. So there's a whole system that obviously identifies both genders belonging to a particular varna based on guna, karma, vibhaga, shaha, or as Bhagavad Gita Krishna says, he based on quality and based on karma activity. Then that's what makes you a varna. So in saying actually women have no varna, if you take it just simplistically like that, you're practically denying them their individual nature. You say women are kind of like an undefined thing unless they get married, which is like, I mean, who would seriously claim such a thing if you look at it like this? So obviously this is not holding up against this concept, for example. Well, if it would be like this, why making such, how to say, important or like very careful considerations about who can marry whom? If there wouldn't be any reality to women having their varna. And they show also practically, like Rukmini was a princess Krishna married, and she was a Kshatriya lady. And as such, she was not just like there being able to sit pretty on a throne. No, she was capable to ride a chariot, which is quite a thing. Because when Krishna stole her, and Krishna was fighting, she was driving the chariot, and so on. So there are probably many examples, like with Kashyapa Muni and Diti. He was a brahmana, and she was married to him, coming, I guess, from a Kshatriya background. And when she was dejected, because there was the whole story, she didn't have a child yet, her co-wives had, and she was perturbed. And he addresses her, asking her, what's wrong? Weren't you able, for example, to perform your daily sacrifices? Which is important. So he asked her about some occupational duty she was usually performing, sacrifices, which is a Brahman's business. So obviously, in order to also assist the husband in the duties, the woman must have a certain nature and abilities to do so. So therefore, I don't understand why people would say women have no varna.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. I think there's a quote from Prabhupada which led, some people to this conclusion. There was a reporter that asked Prabhupada, what is the position of women? And then he replied, that I already explained. Women's position is subordinate to the man. So if the man is first class, the woman is first class. If the man is second class, the woman is second class. If the man is third class, the woman is third class in this, because the woman is meant for assisting the man. So the woman becomes suitable according to the man, to her husband. But I think personally, the way I understand this is Prabhupada is basically just explaining the principle, as you explained earlier, that we have in Vedic culture and we also have in Vedic astrology, that a woman has to marry someone of the same varna, and she has to marry someone that she can look up to, or someone that is of a higher varna. And for that reason, we have this idea that if the man is first class, the woman is first class. But that also shows that a first class woman would be superior to a second class man. We have to, acknowledge, that as well. So I think this statement can be understood from many different angles, but I will definitely go for the angle that it means that a woman should be matched to a man. And ideally, and I think most women would agree if they can pick their ideal partner, they're going to pick someone that they look up to and not pick someone that they feel superior to. So we see this as, I think, a very common psychological phenomenon.
Yeah, it's a very valid point. And I also think, naturally, maybe related to that, like women can by nature, like since they have also like obviously, I mean, it's a form of impersonalism if you would go that way, saying, yeah, women have no varna and make them kind of a bit, how to say, stripped of their individual nature. For example, now in my working place, my boss now is a woman. And I think she does a great job. And I feel inspired to work with her because I see how she has the nature and the capability to do this job. I wouldn't feel so comfortable in this role because certain aspects, well, I could address and do. But what I see is, for example, service attitude, a certain way of thinking. You have to have a certain mindset for certain jobs, that you also see things, perceive them. And the result is I feel inspired and I have no problem to acknowledge that capacity because if the competence is there, that's what matters. So the gender should be actually secondary. And I think also naturally, if we say now, like if a woman meets a man who's truly qualified, who has competences that she can acknowledge and feel inspired by, and then she can accept him in a leader position. But if he comes and said, because I'm in a male body, therefore you have to obey me, then we are simply on the false ego platform and it doesn't work.
Thank you. It's very interesting. Actually, it really nicely dovetails onto the next part of our conversation I wanted to move to, which is around how what determines your dharma. Because most people say, people try and pick or should be picking your occupations based on your dharma, for instance. And there are some ladies, particularly Vaishnavis, I've heard saying, we are women, so our dharma or nature should just be to be playing that feminine role, and we shouldn't be doing, I've even heard people say, doing masculine jobs like leadership positions, because that's not the done thing, that goes against our sort of nature or how we are formed. So just wanted to pick up on the point, what is it, the gender that defines somebody's dharma, or is it their varna? What actually defines somebody's dharma?
In my understanding, there are like 4 aspects that are being done when a child is born. Um, one is of course the what was already mentioned. There's a chart, an astrological chart. If it's a competent astrologer, can also be a female, then then you can see certain nature. If it's valid, if it matches. So from there you can make conclusions what this child's nature and occupation might be. Then there's training, of course. The regular cultural thing of Semitic society is that people are like children are engaged in different types of activities, and you figure out where these people good at. Simple as we also do in our society. I mean, that's a very reasonable way to go, to provide opportunities that people can show what is their nature and what are they good at. So if in some things they're not very good at, but you think because you're born in such a family, you must be able to do that, we have a problem, you know. So then there's some tests sometimes they do at birth. I don't know how many people still do that, but I was also told when we asked that question, determining the dharma, that there are certain items placed in front of the child, let's say a book, and there's some money or some gold, and you try to see the tendency, where does the child go, and from there some conclusions are being drawn, and then there's was another thing that I don't recall now, but yeah, there's certain
But
things, but
what
the essential.
defines, Prabhu? What differs? Because some people have a very strong idea. Maybe I didn't articulate my question properly. I think the point here is some people really think or see one's gender as defining one's
Mhm.
dharma. If you're a woman, you've got to be a housewife, but be the carer, be that motherly role. And I see some women, trying to, play these social norms and are really struggling to be mothers. And I know some of my friends that have decided, actually watching their siblings bring up kids, decided actually motherhood is not for me. I might be expected to be one, but I don't feel qualified, I don't have the attributes or the nature within me to become a mother. But some people might see this as, no, your gender is female, therefore your role, your predominant role that you should play in society and family is being that mother, the wife. So it does our gender define our dharma, or to what extent does one's gender play a role in defining one's dharma?
Well, yeah, um, there is some concept like Stri Dharma, or like Stri, relating a term to the woman, and Stri is that what extends, or what becomes more. Sometimes also translated as what helps the man to extend, to expand by family and so on. So from there, it is concluded that a woman's primary duty, occupation, is to become a mother. But I think it's besides that, a woman is always more as a man, is not just a father, for example. But as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, we can use that verse in the fourth chapter, Chaturvanya Mayashrishtam Guna Karma Vibhagashaha. He said, I created these four varnas based on guna and karma. So natural quality and activity. So that what naturally stems from or flows from your psychophysical nature, what enables you to do certain things, that's your dharma. Dharma is that, like as we say, the unchangeable nature of a thing, that which is the essential identity, what also maintains the thing. Let's say fire, like it's always said, fire has heat and light. So naturally, that's the dharma of the fire, is to give light and to heat up things, as the sugar is supposed to sweeten and so on. So whatever is there on quality, on guna and karma, that determines one's dharma. That's my understanding. On the Swadharma, we must maybe say, because there's the Swadharma relating to the physical body, and everyone has the Sanatan Dharma as a soul to be engaged in the loving service of the Lord. That can vary. That can be very also different from your Swadharma. But as we also say, people, let's say a man is like the typical, let's say, Shudra, and is a worker, maybe even a construction worker. So he works, he doesn't just build temples, obviously, he must build all kinds of buildings. So he's engaged in work, and then he can chant, and then he can do things. So he has next to his Swadharma, his Sanatana Dharma, being engaged in Krishna service. And so everyone has two types of Dharma anyway. So the Swadharma is relating to the body, and the Sanatana Dharma is the spiritual, or like Krishna conscious Dharma, and they might ideally flow together, that you can use them simultaneously in Krishna service. Um, but yes, and depending also, you might have different abilities in your spiritual life. If you're good in presenting, for example, knowledge, or if you're a good learner and a good presenter and speaker, so why shouldn't you go and preach and teach? Whereas on the other hand, you could have a man who doesn't know how to speak well or grasp knowledge, but he's a man, so he should sit and speak, and his wife should shut up because of gender. So that would be who would benefit from that really? So it's more, that would be more of an ego thing. It's about, I think, acknowledging guna and karma, and then we come to dharma. That would be my understanding.
Thank you. That was really helpful because I think people get it all goes back to that idea of having a healthy relationship with one's gender, but not that, but transcending gender. Having that, understanding, acknowledging it, but also seeing us, more than our gender. Because I think, to be honest, personally, nothing breaks my heart more than other Vaishnavis putting each other down, saying, why are you doing this? Because you should be doing this. These are masculine duties or masculine roles. We should be all back in the kitchen, or somewhere making garlands. It's not saying that. Again, we need to acknowledge one size doesn't fit all. Again, it comes back to the point about guna karma. If you're gonna, if your nature, if you feel that that's where you should be, I think we should, there's this tendency to then pose it or try and impose your ability and your character onto others. I think that's where we need to, as a sort of community, we need to address this, where we embrace people for their differences and let people serve Guru and Krishna according to their guna karma. I think there's quite some people, there's this certain, I think I get very carried away about this topic because it's actually, nothing honestly breaks my heart. I can take a man telling me, or anybody else, oh, you should be doing this, but when another Vaishnavi or other Vaishnavis put other people down, branding them names, saying they should be doing XYZ because they're a woman, that honestly is there's nothing that's disheartening more than that. But let's not get carried away. Shraddha has many more important things to follow up now.
Hare Krishna Prabhu, thank you for explaining how a person's dharma, can be determined, or they can understand their dharma. I think one more thought I had, um, on dharma, not swadharma, but dharma is, it also depends on the relationship, which you're in. Like one individual does not, only have one function in a life. I might be a mother, I might be a teacher, I might be a friend, I might be a sister. At work, I might need to be the leader. So I think that's also, a key aspect of this. And if we say that, for instance, women should be allowed to be managers, we see that are women that are excellent managers. And if you think about a traditional extended family, managing the household was quite an extensive task. We know that Draupadi was managing the palace. You need quite significant managerial skills, to do so successfully. So I think we can simultaneously say that women should be allowed to be in management, to be in leadership. That does not mean that we're saying that women should go home and dominate a husband and boss him around. Again, you could be a leader at work, and at home, you could still be respectful, and honor your husband. So I think sometimes we deflate those ideas. Saying a woman should be able to teach if she's very Brahminical, we're also saying that she should always be instructing her husband. It's like, that's not what we're saying. We're saying in different situations, different people might be suited to different services. So I think we need to have that, flexibility. It also, I think, depends on the phase of your life. So many different aspects.
Sure. I mean, also, if you look at it, I mean, in so many cases, what women, how to say, shoulder, use this term, they shoulder a lot of stuff, like in family businesses, for example. What if the husband gets sick or like dies in war? I mean, who carried on the family? And who this needs ability, for example. I mean, this may be some examples, but generally, yeah. And we also need to look, what culture do we live in fact. We do not live in a Vedic society. I think this is something that's so to understand. We cannot just like come and say that's all wrong, and then this whole thing, women should be allowed to this. Who will be the person or the persons to allow and disallow things?
Oh,
I'm
we've got the
sorry.
Taliban. We have the
Well,
Taliban.
yeah, some regimes, I would feel very uncomfortable to be in that role and having to tell people what they, in this regards, what they're allowed to, not allowed to. Yeah, so therefore, certainly, women show practically it's a reality that they can not just succeed but excel in so many fields. the men do. Perhaps even that they are, how to say, achieve even higher. Let's say there's so many very smart, intelligent female scientists, or also there are philosophers and thinkers. Doctors. So many in the field of medicine. It requires quite some substance also to be able, or like a chirurg, for example, to. My God, you need so much ability to do that. And I think if a man is truly intelligent, he actually lets his wife, or like the woman, to do the things, because he will benefit from it also. Because first of all, if let's say if a woman is better than a man in terms of keeping the finances together, he would be unintelligent to take it. No, I'm the man, I should do it, but I'm not good at it. Where he has a woman who could handle the things very properly, and it would be for the benefit of both. So intelligence means to acknowledge where there's also mutual interest, and where there is a benefit from allowing people to just be who they are, like, and have their abilities, and not just trying to impose things.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. I just have one quick follow-up comment. You were mentioning that in situations where there's a war, for instance, men might be, going off to war, men might, be deceased. Then what happens? Usually the women continued. So one interesting thing that I've seen often is people like to speak about traditional roles, like what women did traditionally, as if all women traditionally, only had children and were cooking and cleaning. And I think that's historically, it's just unsound. Thinking about South Africa, we had the Anglo-Boer War, and that was in 1899. So, I mean, definitely like a traditional, period for especially South Africa. Anglo-Boer War, the men, the Boers who were farmers, they went to the war. The women continued farming. They ran, the farms, and we're talking about, livestock, big farms. And after some time, many of the women actually joined the war, and they were fighting, they were supplying the husbands with ammunition, with food. So, I mean, that is at a time where society was traditional, but we see women, playing various roles. And of course, not all the women joined the war effort, but almost all the women in some way or the other participated, in the war. So I find it very interesting, this myth, I would say, about the traditional woman. But let's move on to another topic that we did wanted to cover. So we spoke a lot about the importance of transcending, gender consciousness, not being limited by gender. But at the same time, in, I think, religious, spiritual communities, we often see that people can internalize a hatred for the body, a hatred for their gender. And this can also not be healthy. So what is the value of having a healthy identity based on your gender or your occupation? And what is the risk if people don't have that? What is the risk of people, for instance, internalizing hate? I think this we often see with women in religious communities, where they're often told, women are inferior, women are the personification of sin, etc., etc.
I think two big benefits are peacefulness and satisfaction. If you are in, let's say, also in peace with your physical body, or like your psychophysical nature, you can function. If you're very busy with hating your body, or like your mind, or your gender, or sexual orientation, whatever, then usually this occupies you so much, it can occupy it so much it becomes dysfunctional for daily life. So this is not wanted. Why would you want to be, how to say, maybe sabotaging yourself even, based on the self-hatred. And satisfaction is also, I think, important, even if a body has, let's say, disadvantages. For me, let's say I struggle with a certain nature I have, because if you talk of nature and also gender, we must also, in the Ayurvedic Shastras, I cannot quote exactly where, someone just told me that once, and I think it's a reliable source, that there's a distinction between male mind and female mind, and that a person can have a male body, for example, or a female body, and accordingly, but a male mind or female mind, what makes them different in character and personality and temperament. So, and if you put, let's say, just like a man together, who has a who has a female mind with a woman who has a male mind, based on that, she will naturally be the more dominant one. And it works for both of them because his, like, also mental nature is like that. All this was the other way around. So there's also one consideration that the body alone does not constitute the masculinity or femininity. It's also the mind or the mindset we have within a given body. And therefore different couples work differently and it's fine for them. You don't have to go and say, well, that's not correct according to, well, that's just how they work. Nature goes its way also. Yes, and if there's peace with it, if I say, okay, I accept here I'm different, or here I do not fit with the norm, or like here I have certain way of how to say, how I want to work, how a career I want to take. If I can be satisfied, if I allow myself to be satisfied, let's say I have a nature that doesn't allow me to do certain things. Let's say I'm a man and like my typical, let's say stereotypical image could be as a man, I must be very muscular, I must be able to fight, do martial arts. But now the fact is I'm sensitive, I'm skinny, I cannot really handle a lot of stuff like that. So what do? Am I now going and say, oh, I'm so miserable, I'm not a real man? And then I go through life and, oh God, what is my dharma? Actually, my dharma would be to fight, but wait a second, no, like look at what do I have, and not what do I don't have. And then look at that and say, okay, this is what I'm equipped with. I maybe would have wished for something else, who wouldn't? Sometimes we always have things where it would feel like there could be improvements. But if I allow myself to be, also in a profession, to say, okay, I'm satisfied with what I have now. That means I'm in peace with what is. Then I can also practice spiritual life. If my mind is constantly disturbed with me not being able to relate to my body or like gender in an accepting, compassionate way, then also this disturbs my spiritual life. And how can I even employ this nature properly in spiritual life if I resent it? So I think that's actually crucial to be in peace, or like to find ways, or to be able to find peace with where you're at, what your nature is, in order to engage that in spiritual life.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. And I think it's only when we have self-acceptance and when we are at peace with ourselves, it's only at that point that we can offer it to other people. So I often think that, those who are, constantly feeling that they need to be policing others, correcting others, informing others of their mistakes, it's because they lack self-acceptance. They're not at peace, with themselves. So I think it's very important that we also understand that it definitely begins, cultivating that radical self-acceptance for yourself, and then growing that circle of compassion from there.
But important also from the outside, it is then to facilitate people in finding that peace. Because if there's constant, like, let's say, we try to impose, as you said, we impose things in certain norms and make people uncomfortable or unpeaceful with it, we don't do them really a service. And also the fact is it doesn't change anything. Let's say if you go to a person who, like, let's say to a man who's homosexual, who said, you're supposed to be heterosexual. What happens? So does something change? No, he will be what he is and I will be them or the person, and then that doesn't do there's no benefit for anyone. So, but it's about, okay, like where you're at is where you're at. And it's even sounds a bit kind of perhaps even arrogant if you would say, I allow you to stay where you are, because why doesn't it need my allowance? But simply to have an attitude of like, okay, I acknowledge you for who you are, and you acknowledge me for who I am, and we allow to cooperate in peace, and try to find ways, even if it's not always easy, whatever it might be, the issue,
Thank you so much, Prabhu. I was just reflecting, on what you were saying. It's so important that we also don't create disturbance for others. And that's actually one of the things that makes us dear to Krishna. If we are everyone's well-wisher and we're not causing pain, and that includes psychological, emotional pain, unduly to others. Currently in South Africa, one of the main churches, the DRC, they recently, or a couple of years ago, they mandated that gay men are allowed to become ministers. And this has in turn outraged several of the DRC's churches. And now several of these churches are in mourning because they disagree with that mandate, and they want to, exclude gay men from being ministers and exclude them from the church congregation, etc., etc. My uncle is a minister, and I was discussing this with him. And one point that I made, and I think this is very important for us also when it comes to like ideas about gender, etc., is it's one thing to talk about things in theory. Like we can say, like, yes, gay men should not be allowed. We don't want so many gay devotees, or a woman should always have this or that position in a marriage. But it becomes different when you're sitting with the person in front of you, and that person has a different nature, and that person, wants to be facilitated spiritually. What are you going to do then? So it's like one thing, making policies, making mandates, making rules. It's another thing finding practical ways to facilitate people, to grow in devotional service and to flourish. And I think we need to distinguish between those two. As you said, that there's many ways, for instance, in which a marriage can work. There's not like one set way. In the same way, there's not like only one set way a man can be a man and also flourish as a devotee. So I think it's very important for us to differentiate between like abstract ideals in our minds and what's actually going to work for people. And Prabhupada was very practical like that. I think he considered what's going to work for this devotee.
Well, yeah, coming to the point also of sexuality, which of course goes along with the gender debate. The term is used, Maitunya Agara, that the material world is considered a place, like Maitunya Agara, meaning the shackles of sex life. That every living entity is actually bound by these shackles. And sometimes Prabhupada gives distinctions where he uses golden shackle, silver shackle, bronze, whatever. So there are different types of shackles, but like saying different sexual kind of orientations or needs, but it remains a shackle. So also maybe important to consider is if you talk about sexuality, for example, that heterosexuality alone is not a virtue. Only actually regulated heterosexuality would be in the eyes of Shastra something good, but actually Shastra at the end says one should come to the point of giving up all sexuality, no matter whether it's hetero or homosexuality. So saying the difference might be simply how can I employ certain sexuality in Krishna service. So therefore the heterosexuality is favored because in this sense children can be born and embraced and so on. But essentially the thing is like also it depends on how am I really detaching myself, how do I control my urges and so on. This would be relevant, not just what is my how to say sexual inclination in the first place.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Prabhu. And also, I think we picked up on how individuals should be allowed to flourish rather than get certain social, cultural expectations or ideas of gender to impact on their ability to contribute to society and make progress in spiritual life. However, it's easily said than done, isn't it? Because often we see devotees in particular looking at the Vedic cultural, social cultural norms around gender, being considered as the way in which we should live, even in the modern 21st century, although, the Vedic times were for a completely different yuga. So, I mean, that question aside, is there anything that is around gender, social and cultural norms that were held in the Vedic time, so the Vedic social cultural norms that we could still be upheld with reasonable arguments in the modern society? For instance, occupation. We spoke about gender and occupation, but another thing around women should always treat their husbands as their gurus. So that was one of the Vedic social cultural norms that was based on gender. So, are there anything along these lines or any other things that we could still upheld and think, okay, these things that were upheld are actually also relevant in today's society?
certainly the example that you mentioned at last, like if the woman is supposed to look at the husband as a guru, that provides he has been trained properly, provides he has been sent to an ashram where he received proper training, and he gained certain qualifications. So again, what we can take is the principle guna and karma, um, and to, for example, when it comes to who comes together with whom, to not see an how to say arranged marriages. They're really, who likes that? Oh my God, who do I get? Something perhaps, although it's not so simple. Often it's like a bit more differentiated. But to see that there's merit in, it makes sense to consider the nature of both firsthand in the first place, and then see whether they match, and then not come from the basis of passion or romance naturally necessarily. I mean, it can work perhaps. I would experience it that doesn't. um, but to figure the nature of both and see what is the compatibility. So I think this is what we can take, but it requires, of course, also ability and expertise to really see what is the nature of both if they come together, to serve Krishna. Because the essential Vedic thing is a relationship should facilitate your spiritual growth. That's essentially the thing. So if you have this in mind, if you say, okay, in this relationship, okay, there is good reason to think that I and her, we will benefit spiritually, we will advance together because we support each other in our spiritual lives. Plus, also on a simply human platform, we work together and fit. So I think that's we can take certainly from the Vedic version. I mean, that's the essence what Srila Prabhupada also told us. At the end, all rules and regulations shall serve the purpose that you always remember Krishna, never forget him. But if like all our rules and regulations lead us into endless debates about gender and God knows what else, it's just like there's so many things, political issues you can absorb in, and then we do not actually aim at this goal.
Thank you, Prabha. I think that was really helpful. And the other thing that's quite related to what we just covered is something we also touched upon slightly before in the discussion around having healthy relationships between the male and female genders. I am actually relatively new to the movement, but I always see in temples, in devotional settings, we seem to really actually have quite awkward interactions between women and men most of the time. I think we spoke about how this might be informed by fear, but how do we encourage positive male and female interaction, particularly in devotional settings, and overcome certain challenges that enable men and women to work closely together to overcome these challenges?
I mean, I think this could fill a whole seminar, many sessions. I think it's a uh,
In
topic. I mean,
short, I mean, because
it's,
I've
yes.
honestly, yeah.
I mean, a start could be in like investing in one's own becoming mature. Like I think maturity is key here. That we move away from very simplistic viewpoints, understandings, or like even fear-driven kind of assumptions, and but become more like uh, mature in the sense that we see things also more holistically. That we and not just like try to live up to norms and ideals that are actually not really our internalized norms and values, but to really look, where do I stand? It requires honesty, um, to look at where do I stand, and then from that can come from a much more healthy place, relating to others instead of if need to I think I need to represent something that I'm not, or like a certain cultural value where that is not internalized in me, it's artificial. So, and also taking our philosophy seriously, that says you're not this body, you're a spiritual soul, and this is not true for you only, this is true for everyone else. So, in conclusion, you actually should, in the first place, see in others also a creature of Krishna, like the Krishna has created, which is, you can relate to his brother and sister, or like at least to another jiva, also in a different body. And this would be the first consideration. And then the second consideration, okay, this jiva is a different body. But if my first consideration, oh, there's a body with it, and then the jiva is like, I think to invest in that, it's not simply done by, oh, okay, now I do it. It's an investment in consciously try to develop that vision. And then we can move, I think, to a more healthy communication and exchange where we have an equal platform, because he said, Prabhupada said, the true equality is on a spiritual platform. And we must go in both ways to say, okay, let's invest in my spiritual vision, but also let's learn how to deal with the different bodies we have. So both at the same time.
No, thank you. I think the things I took away is, having that maturity and the honesty to understand where you are. And I think if you're in touch with who you are and you're honest around, if you're having struggles in controlling your emotions or whatever, don't try to be acting as if you're on a higher platform and you're a sadhu. Just, I think, admit it, be humble and accept where you are in your position. Just treat others
Mm.
with respect. And I think this is where we see problems, where people try and almost deny their feelings and like kind of try and act more elevated than they are, rather than
Mm.
being in touch. And that leads to unhealthy relationships where people try to then enforce things, artificially, rather than it becoming a relationship that's based on mutual respect and understanding of the other person for who they are, beyond their gender or position, really. So thank you, Prabhu.
Perhaps just shortly to add, I see also we a bit overtime of it, I guess. Um, what is also, I think, part of it is, if you talk of relationships, if relationships don't work, and we see they won't work for long, or like we can't
Mm.
find solutions. To also be able to acknowledge that, and also to acknowledge, okay, where's my part or my inability in it, if a relationship doesn't work, and say, okay, we give it up for the benefit of both, for example, instead of clinging to, but it has to be like this, or like because of you. So also there's this natural humility to see where are my limitations, or where I'm not capable, to have the relationship in a way that it doesn't work. So to really take a responsibility and be accountable for how do I contribute to a functioning or not functioning relationship.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. You made various very helpful and insightful points. I think one thing that came to my mind earlier when you spoke about, the Vedic idea that a woman should always see her husband as a guru and treat him accordingly. And then you were mentioning, yes, well, if the husband is qualified, if the husband was trained, if the husband can actually take that position. So one thought that I had was that every Vedic principle requires a certain relationship. And the absence of that relationship, the principle simply does not work and can actually do harm. If we're looking at that example, if you have a husband that is abusive and you treat him like guru, it will be harmful, for you, for him, and also for the, rest of the family. And I think every single Vedic principle requires a certain relationship, and a certain relationship, requires that the people in the relationships have, as you've mentioned, certain levels of maturity and also, certain virtues. So now to conclude our discussion, we discussed how a part of transcending gender consciousness is addressing discrimination, whether it's discrimination that we see happening or whether it's us discriminating unjustly towards others. However, we see in the world that sometimes when people try to address discrimination, whether that's racial discrimination, sexual discrimination, or another type of cultural discrimination, we see that sometimes it becomes counterproductive. We do know that in certain forms of modern feminism, they want to advocate for the fair treatment of women and equitable opportunities for women, but they end up advocating hating men, and putting men down. So that is an example where it's become counterproductive. So how can we address issues of discrimination without creating further polarization and further, what can we say, discontent.
Well, something I think I can, my, how to say, 10 cents to that are certainly being, first of all, aware whether I am simply reactive to what's going on or if I'm consciously acting. Because I think reactivity is one of the very toxic things that people come from a place of hurt or hurt ego, and then it goes just the contrary. Like I have been hurt by him, for example, now I hurt him back. We have this kind of mode of passion thing going on, which is not fair. I just exchange one injustice with another. Let's say if my this is not a solution to just have to, instead of hatred from one side to the other, now I have hatred from the other side as well. uh, so I think what is important would be to how to say, to have an attitude, first of all, of humility, to be able to be self-critical. If I cannot see, or I'm not willing to see, how do I contribute to a certain conflict or a certain injustice, I won't be able to solve it. So it starts with actually looking at oneself. Okay, what do I need to do? What do I need to contribute that the possibility of positive change can grow, can happen. So in situations where there's hatred and there's a lot of hurt, um, I think it's also important to be able to look at what do I need right now, actually. And usually people then need healing. They need some form of growing back together, not just reacting. How to say, have another fight. Although this often it ends up like that. Um, so yeah, not being just reactive, but being conscious and see what's happening for me, acknowledging things, and coming from a place of conscious choice when I respond to something, and not. And this allows me also, for example, to not go into traps of provocation, for example, that I'm not just like, how to say, jump on the train of just one ego clashes with the other. Uh, I don't know whether this is helpful.
Thank you, no, Prabhu. That was very helpful. I think one thing that came to my mind was that in our process, of addressing an issue, as you pointed out, often we first have to go through a process of healing for ourselves, understanding our needs, expressing our needs, and then seeing how we can meet our needs in a healthy way. But I think we should also meditate upon how can we heal the situation, how can we heal everyone involved and not just like win the argument, or how can we not like conquer the situation, get what we want, but how can we address the issue in such a way that everyone is better off, in the end.
And also another thing that came to my mind when we spoke around, the idea Sharadi mentioned about feminism and how it kind of good intentions but unintended consequences can lead to that polarization, because we see the results of positive discrimination. Certain people then, discriminating, saying you're only there because you are XYZ, but also having that tolerance for each other, understanding we might be seeking two different outcomes or two different, you know outcomes for two different, completely different people, or fighting for two different causes, but that idea of working together. And that's why the idea of feminism has a very bad reputation. So to instance, people label people as feminists, or and then also think, oh, they're against women, they advocate all women's to become leaders or not to become mothers. So people tend to get very black and white when it comes to lead, addressing the idea of discrimination against both sexes. And I think it's having that maturity to understand where the other party is coming from, and having that respective dialogue and having mutual respect towards each other, and both genders and all, everybody on all sides of the coin, as we say, working together towards a better outcome for everybody. I think that's where it is missing in a lot of these conversations, particularly around very emotional issues or emotive issues around gender inequalities and discrimination issues around that, really.
Keshava Madhava Prabhu, I want to thank you very much for giving us your valuable time tonight and sharing with us your thoughts, your realizations, your insights, and also from your experiences from your work. Is there anything you would like to share in closing?
What just came to my mind is that one misconception is that it is very spiritual to distinguish, or how to say, just discriminate between genders, because it apparently is based on the Shastra.
Mm,
So this again, like this would be what we call confusing ignorance with transcendence. I'm so spiritual, I'm
mm,
looking, but actually Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, if you the vision or the viewpoint that sees practically in each different body, even a different soul, is in a mode of passion. I mean, this is not like, okay, seeing different soul in different bodies, but it goes in a direction that we somehow or other do not see the unity of the self so much if we focus too much on different genders.
mm,
It is there. It certainly is a reality. It cannot be just denied. Like in for example, in regards to race and racism, you cannot pretend, say, "Oh no, I'm colorblind." It doesn't work. You will, it's just also a reality. You will see differences. It's how you respond
mm,
to them. The same with gender. I mean, it's really so important to embrace our teachings. And what is the essential teaching in the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita? It's about how the self is different from the body, and that we play different roles. What we had from the beginning, to actually come
mm,
back to this point, to invest in our spiritual understanding of
mm,
our true self. And this will solve a lot of issues, because if I truly come
mm,
from a place where I think in terms of spiritual self playing different roles, then I
mm,
have grounds for true
mm,
equality. you
mm,
know Whereas when I don't
mm,
have that, then I get caught up in so many so-called material identifications. And I
mm,
think that's something I also try to attempt to really to invest in my spiritual vision, and not
mm,
try to take others first. You said it in the questions also. Sometimes people upholders of the Vedic version say first the women must change, must be all ultra,
mm.
um, how to say that? What is it? Koish? This term,
Chaste?
taste, yes, and this and
Mm,
this and the man. No, it's about being accountable. First of all, I train myself to have a proper vision based on Shastra, and then this will be
mm,
auspicious.
mm. Thank you so much, Prabhu. I think when you are at the receiving end of discrimination, when you are, at the receiving end of even hateful, um, comments, remarks, exchanges, it is difficult, not to start, like hating the haters. But I think it's very good to, as you say, um, to work on ourselves. And I think I really like this verse from the Srimad Bhagavatam, where Prahlad Maharaj, I think, is really expressing the heart of a devotee. It's in the fifth canto, the 18th chapter. And Prahlad Maharaj says, "May there be good fortune throughout the universe, and may all envious persons be pacified. May all living entities become calm by practicing bhakti yoga, for by accepting devotional service, they will think of each other's welfare. Therefore, let us all engage in the service of the Supreme Transcendent, Lord Shri Krishna, and always remain absorbed in thought of Him." So I do think it's a beautiful meditation to end our discussion on. We want to really become each and every person's well wisher. and we want to meditate upon how we can engage in service and also facilitate others engaging in service. So thank you so much for everyone that joined us online. We appreciate your presence. We appreciate your very active participation in the discussion tonight. Please do feel free to leave us more comments and questions. Share your thoughts and your realizations on this topic on any one of the places that we streamed. Also, please do feel free to let us know if there's other topics you would like us to cover. And if you have not done so yet, please do connect with us on Facebook. We've got a Sattvi Sangha page, and also on YouTube, we're Sattvi Sangha Official. So please do connect with us. And also, if you find this discussion valuable, do consider to share it, because we do want to help to spread ideas which we think are more holistic, more beneficial to have a healthy, thriving devotee community. So thank you so much, and we're gonna wish everyone good night. Hare Krishna.